So, Tassiegramer,
Yes, Kieran?
you always seem to be paying out photographers that blow out their skies and ruin their highlights.
I wouldn't say that I'm paying them out, but yes, go for it.
Throwing you under the bus again.
Yes, thank you for that.
If anyone noticed any particular audio issues in the last episode, you seem to have blown out your audio highlights in your side of the audio.
Mate, I think I just had my audio compensation dialed up 2 stops. So, I definitely did have a bit of an issue. But what I was really trying to do was give you a bit of a challenge and see if you could apply some sort of luminosity masking to my voice and pull down the highlights and, kind of fix it in the editing process.
Well, it's probably a good thing no one heard the original, and I think I did pretty well to really rescue your audio highlights from the last episode there.
Yeah, no, I think you did. You did all right, but I think you got to try harder next time. You've done pretty well, removing voice dust spots and things. But now you've got to practice with the, bringing back the highlights or highlights 2 or whatever it is, and just learning to fix that now. So,
well, I must say you're sounding a lot better now.
Thank you. Yeah, I've taken the microphone about 40 centimetres away from my mouth rather than attaching it to my chin today. So I think, hopefully this episode will be a little bit better.
So you're not making out with the microphone this time?
No, not this time. I'm trying not to drool on it too much. So no, let's just hope this one works out. I don't want to record an hour and a half worth of audio and then find out later that it's screwed up again.
We need to have something good after. We should be professionals since this is episode 10.
Yeah, episode 10. That's pretty cool. I mean, that's a full 2 hands of episodes now. That's awesome.
Yeah, I can count each episode on both hands.
No, that's really cool. And obviously, we had some awesome news during the week with hitting within the top 5 of tech podcasts on iTunes on the daily podcast charts. There's a lot to it, to the algorithms that kind of make that happen. But to be 9 episodes in and to already be in the top 5 podcasts worldwide for tech, that's pretty awesome. And obviously our audience has helped us get there by listening to us, which is really cool. I would like for anybody who is listening, if they could take the time to leave us a review on iTunes. If you do listen through iTunes or through any of the iTunes syndicated podcast apps, that'd be awesome. I mean, we've had some great reviews come through already, and thank you so much for the support for everybody who's listening, because it's been a bit of a ride over the last 2 months for us, and the support that we've had from everybody just makes us want to keep doing this. So
yeah, and if you want to help support the show as well and help us give away great prizes and offers to our listeners, you can check us out on Patreon as well. And if you want, you can support the show through that. On a small amounts of donations towards the show can really help improve our ability to give listeners great prizes, I suppose.
Awesome. And speaking of great prizes, fstoppers.com, again, for this episode, are offering a fantastic prize of a tutorial, any tutorial, valued at US $299 from their website. So again, a massive thank you to fstoppers.com for the ongoing support they've shown us as well. So just keep the images rolling in on Instagram, hashtagging Project RAWcast and mentioning us clearly within the caption. So Sunday, 18th of December at 6 p.m, we'll announce a winner of this particular episode. Of this particular prize. Just keep those images rolling in, and massive thank you to F-Stoppers.
And also, again, thank you to our show sponsor, Nissi Filters Australia, for their ongoing support of the show and offering our listeners a 5% discount off any purchase from nissifilters.com.au when you use the coupon code Project RAWcast.
It's awesome. Thank you again, Nissi, for your ongoing support. It's been really awesome to have your support ever since the beginning of this podcast series. So it's really cool. Kieran, we touch quite a lot, or anybody who knows us would know very well that we're very much fans of Canon products, and we have been pretty much our entire photography lives, I suppose. We're both very much tied into the ecosystem of Canon through our lenses, our camera bodies, and pretty much anything else that we've used over the years. But we joke a bit about how Canon is the best brand. I mean, we say it a lot, and I'm pretty sure anybody who uses any specific Canon or camera brand would believe that what they're using is probably the best.
Yeah, I'd say so. I've been using Canon since even just point and shoot whenever I was just starting out when I was younger and just going out and getting a camera because I was traveling around. Before I got into photography, I was even just using those Canon cameras and I absolutely loved them. As you were saying, anyone who uses a Canon camera or any kind of camera would say that theirs is the best, but is it actually true?
As we all know, many times these are jokes within the community. You know, if you're using Nikon, whatever you want to call it, you believe that Nikon is the best. If you're using Sony, quite often you'll hear the guys who are using Sony swearing by their brand. And many times it is really down to your own personal choice of what you use to this. And it's funny to kind of hear these jokes. We make them quite a lot. Obviously, in a few earlier episodes, we were calling Nikon cameras potato cameras and those sort of things. But the thing is, like, it doesn't really matter what brand you're using. And I think this is a big thing. You know, everybody is kind of aware of this, that camera brands are so close together with the technology these days that, you know, it really, if you're using Nikon or Canon or Sony, you're probably going to produce images that are just as good as each other if you know what you're doing with the camera, of course. One thing that I'm a firm believer of is that the competition within these camera brands helps to continually create innovation within the camera market. So it's actually healthy to have such great, successful brands. Obviously, in the old days, it was Canon vs Nikon, but these days, Sony has very much taken a massive part of the market share for professional DSLR cameras with their mirrorless systems. So I think innovation within cameras is a massively important thing for the camera industry.
Yeah, and I think if you are deciding which brand to go down and you ask different photographers and you ask Canon users and they say use Canon, you ask Nikon users, they say use Nikon. What you really need to do is just go to any store, I suppose, pick up a camera and just have a feel of it, see how it feels in your hand, have a look at the menu, see whether it feels intuitive to you, whether you just like the look of it really, because either of those brands or Sony as well, they're good quality products and they're going to do well for your photography as long as you feel comfortable using that product. Absolutely. And the thing, I think Sony has come such a long way within the camera industry, particularly through their current model camera, which is the A7 IIR or A7R2, which is incredible camera. The sensor is just amazing, particularly for low light performance. One thing that I do know with this particular generation of cameras is it's taken Sony a little while to release lenses that are probably of the quality of the other brands, and particularly Canon. I know a lot of Sony users who for a long time have used a Metabones adapter to attach Canon lenses to their Sony for two reasons. One is just Sony for quite a while haven't had the lenses that are probably of the same quality that Canon were producing, and the other side of it is being tied into an ecosystem. The photographers would have invested a lot of money within, the brand that they were using prior to switching to Sony. So being able to utilize the equipment that they had previously or still have on a new camera body has also been a big beneficial thing as well. Also, where Sony has really done well is by having the mirrorless full frame camera as well. And yeah, as you said, being able to use the other lenses, but having that compact, high quality product as well has really given people a different choice between the, by comparison, bigger and bulky digital SLRs of Canon and Nikon. Yeah, for sure. And that's one thing with the Sony bodies as they are. And this is, again, same with Panasonic, Fuji and Olympus as well. The size of the body is able to be smaller simply because it just doesn't have the same mechanisms inside or the moving parts. With the mirror kind of helps send the image up through the viewfinder within DSLRs, whereas on a mirrorless system, the light goes straight through the lens onto a sensor, and then you've got either the viewfinder, the screen on the back of the camera, or an electronic viewfinder, which is basically a digital signal that gets converted into something that you can see and look through on a mirrorless camera. So they are quite different in terms of their technology. And there's one thing I think with with Canon and Nikon at the moment is they are
very much lagging behind in this technology. There's rumors now that Canon are producing or are working on mirrorless full frame camera, which obviously full frame camera is what most professionals are going to use. There are mirrorless cameras in the EOS M3 and the EOS M5 currently on the market, but they don't perform anywhere near as good as a full frame professional camera. Nikon, whether this is true or not, may not necessarily have the money within the business at the moment to be funding the development of full frame cameras. So it'd be interesting to see over the next year or two whether Canon actually do come out with a full frame camera, full frame mirrorless camera to really compete against Sony. Because if Sony go and continue on this path, they are going to be even more dominant force within the DSLR market.
I just like the digital SLR because I like being able to look through the viewfinder and see what I'm actually looking at. Because especially in low light conditions as well, if you're shooting around nighttime, being able to compose your shots, I guess, especially for astrophotography and things like that, you can look through a viewfinder to line up your shots and not have to worry about the digital representation of the scene and whether it's going to be bright enough to even show up on a LCD screen.
Yeah, I think there's something to remember with the electronic viewfinders on mirrorless cameras, though, is what you see through the viewfinder is actually a good representation of exposure levels as well within a scene, particularly if it's good light. Some of them don't work so well in low light, but whereas with the digital SLR that you and I use, obviously we use Canon bodies at the moment, we see the scene through the viewfinder, but we don't see how the scene is going to expose at the settings that you're using. Whereas with an electronic viewfinder on mirrorless cameras, it's actually it's a true representation of what you're seeing through the viewfinder or through the electronic viewfinder of the way the scene is going to expose at the settings you're using as well. So I think in some ways that mirrorless system can actually be beneficial for beginners as well. And it's probably one of the big advantages other than size that the mirrorless systems have over the full body DSLRs that we use.
But you've got that with live view anyway. You can still use not the viewfinder screen, but you can use the back of the screen to see how the image is going to expose anyway. So you've got both options with the digital SLR, but you don't have that with the mirrorless.
Yep, that's good. I think you and I both use obviously DSLRs. I probably don't have the experience that some of the bigger landscape photographers here in Australia do with mirrorless cameras, but I know some of the results these guys are getting with them are phenomenal, and they swear by the system now as well, which is, it's a good selling point, I suppose, for those systems. Yeah,
it's definitely not it does really come down to preference, and there's nothing to say that the sensor on the Sony full frame is any less in terms of quality compared to Canon or Nikon. We know people that use it and swear that the sensor and the images they're producing are just as good as they'd produce on a Canon 5D. And yeah, it does come down to preference and what you feel comfortable using. And if you're looking at your images and you're not seeing any lack in quality for what you're wanting to achieve, then good. That's all you need.
When you think like Nikon now use Sony sensors, so Sony, you've got to be doing something right in terms of this. And I think some of these camera sensors now are starting to also be used in other devices, which are not necessarily a handheld camera, but other camera devices and consumer tech around the world as well. So Sony have done really well with this, and I think obviously we laugh amongst ourselves as photographers about what sort of gear you're using, but it doesn't really matter as long as the camera is producing the right image, the right image quality and kind of suiting your personal purpose as well. If you're traveling a lot, then say the big 5DSR and 5DS and the 5D Mark IIIs that we use may not necessarily be the best proposition. A little Sony mirrorless, which is about half the physical size, may suit the job. Another thing to remember, I think, here is when you start making your tech smaller, things like battery life and those sort of things do become impacted, and it's one issue as compared to a DSLR or a full body DSLR that a mirrorless systems have. If I'm to compare Sony against Canon at the moment, battery life is a lot less, and it's just simply because the batteries are so much smaller as well. So
Canon forever.
But I've got to be honest, I actually almost switched earlier this year. I had a bit of a bad experience, so I don't want to get into it too much at the moment. Thankfully, Canon came to the party, but I actually almost switched to Sony, and I was very, very, very close to doing so, just simply based on some recommendations from some of our mates who are great photographers, and also some of the reviews that I was reading on the current generation Sony mirrorless. I was very, very close to switching, and if it wasn't for the lenses and thankfully the support that ended up coming through, I would have switched. I was on a plane, and I was ready to spend the money when I landed because I was quite frustrated.
You had a weak moment. It's okay. You're still with Canon. It's all right.
Hey, at least it was Sony and not Nikon.
Yeah, true.
But yeah, I even still now, I'd love to see Canon come out with a mirrorless camera, and I think if they don't very soon, then their market share is going to be eaten away even further. So hopefully they do release something soon.
And unless it's your job to review every camera out there, then it's going to be very difficult for the average person starting out in photography to try everything. But the main thing I think is just the feel, the look of the camera, the menus, the functions, the buttons, whether it feels just natural to you. And I guess another thing to consider is whether you do have friends that are photographers and whether they've got the same systems, and you can try different lenses. You can sort of share lenses, try different things as well. And that can help cut down costs as well when you're considering that lenses can be thousands of dollars.
Yeah, definitely. Even if you wanted to try some of the more expensive lenses and those sort of things, you can always rent them as well. There's plenty of lens rental companies out there that will kind of, hire them to you for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it is that you want to try. If you've got a particular project and you want to shoot at a certain focal length or use a certain lens, you can always go and rent them to try before you do buy them. I personally have never done this, but I know that there's plenty of rental companies out there on the market that can do this for you.
Yeah, I've hired tilt shift lenses before, and yeah, it's been great, the hiring process and having those really fantastic lenses just to go out and practice with or shoot for jobs as well. And I know when we were on the Cape Pillar track as well, you had a nice telephoto lens that I borrowed, and you were quite happy for me to take it out of your bag since it was probably the most heaviest thing that you had.
Definitely. No, I was quite happy that you carried that around. Yeah, I mean, that's one of my favorite lenses, and I mean, I've kind of been through many Canon lenses over the years, and I've always fallen back to the 70-300 when I'm traveling and I require a telephoto lens over any of the others, just simply because of the compact size and the performance of it's a great lens. But yeah, like I was very happy that you carried that lens on that trip. Feel free to carry any of my gear anytime you like.
We're going back to the Sherpa thing and having someone carry your gear.
No, yeah, all right. Let's moving on now. Moving on. So yeah, look, as we said, we joke about camera brands all the time. We do it, and I think just about anybody in the photography community does this. I think, but it doesn't really matter what you're using, and we'll continue to joke because it is a joke. But camera brands are so close together now, and without each camera brand in the market, innovation gets stifled and innovation dies off. And it's really important to have that competition between the brands to help continue to push each other. Sony at the moment, I personally believe, are leading the way in innovation. I really hope the Canon do catch up, because I would love to stay with Canon and I'd love to continue using my lenses. But if something does come out that's truly better on the market for the long term, it's one of those things that as a photography may be the thing to push you and drive you towards another brand as well.
All I heard there was it doesn't matter which Canon you use, Nikon's a joke and Sony's a temptation that you shouldn't go for.
That's exactly what I said. So yeah, that's good. Cool. So moving along now, obviously I had some really bad audio last episode, and I made a little bit of a joke about exposure compensation for my voice, but exposure compensation on a camera is maybe one of those completely misunderstood things within the settings themselves. I've probably made a mistake in one of the earlier episodes to say that there's 4 major things within exposure on a camera. Realistically, there's a thing called the exposure triangle, but I added exposure compensation to my way of thinking because I use it quite a lot. You got a good explanation about what exposure compensation is?
Yeah, so if you're shooting in, say, aperture priority or shutter priority modes, then the camera will decide what it thinks is a good exposure for the scene, whether you're using center weighted exposure, spot exposure or anything like that. It'll give you feedback from what it thinks is a correctly exposed scene. And exposure compensation is your input into the camera to say that what the camera thinks is correct exposure is either going to be too dark or too light. And you can say to the camera, I want you to take what you think is correctly exposed and overexpose it or underexpose it.
So exposure compensation is basically a setting or a feature on all cameras that allows you to make the picture lighter or darker than the recommended exposure at any camera settings. Now, that means that it's the entire image as well, not just part of the image, but the entire image. So if you were to be shooting at EV, so exposure compensation on your camera will have like an EV setting. If you were to set it EV, 0 is basically exactly what the camera's recommending. Whereas if you can dial it typically in either direction, up or down, by a third of a stop of light. Now, remembering a stop of light is an actual physical calculation in either direction. So you can make the image brighter by effectively dialing your exposure compensation in the positive way, or you can make it darker by doing it in the negative way. So what you're doing is changing the entire image, not just part of the image. And that's something to remember with exposure compensation as well. So where would you find this useful if you were to be using it?
Well, there's a couple of ways that are good examples of where exposure compensation comes in. And that's, say, if you were shooting a picture of a really snowy scene. So there's a lot of white in the image. And what the camera will do on a just basic kind of level is try and see that scene and expose everything for a mid-gray. So something right in the middle of your histogram. So everything is exposed neatly, so you don't have blown out highlights or really dark shadows. But if you're shooting something like snow, then everything's white, everything's quite bright. And so the camera's going to see that and think, okay, it's a bright scene. I need to expose it less to get that correct exposure. But because everything's white, if you take a photo of what the camera says, it's actually going to be quite dull and a lot darker. So what you would need to do is set your exposure compensation to, say, a full stop of exposure brighter. So you're telling the camera to overexpose what it thinks is correct, and you'll end up getting a exposure that is more true to life of the scene that you see before you.
Yeah. So another common scenario that I would see here would be if you were shooting into the sun, so like a sunset, and say you had a person in the photo or in the image or in the frame. Quite often what will happen is the sky will be correctly exposed and the person will effectively be a silhouette in the image. So you can use exposure compensation to basically
blow out your highlights.
Blow out your highlights, exactly. So the sky's going to be awesome, our favorite type of photography, and the person in the image will actually be correctly exposed. So something I think here, obviously, rather than just doing it as a single frame, when you're shooting bracketed, or you're using an automated way of saying, I'm going to take 3 to 5 to 7 images of this frame, what's actually happening with bracketed exposures is it's using exposure compensation. So it's not really changing, your aperture so much as dialing in more or less light into the frame across that automated method of taking 7 images. So bracketed exposures is doing exactly that, using exposure compensation to take a series of images, which you could then potentially later go away and select the correct image, or go away and select some of those images to blend together in post-processing as well.
And that does depend as well. Like you said there, it doesn't necessarily change your aperture. But if you're shooting in shutter priority and you set your exposure compensation, it will change your aperture size to do the bracketed exposures. If you're shooting in aperture mode, it will change your shutter. And also in manual mode as well, it will change your shutter, not your aperture.
Yep. So if you're shooting in bulb mode, those sort of things, it does absolutely nothing for your camera. I mean, shooting in bulb mode is basically just telling it a single setting that works, and it's exposing for those settings. But yeah, if you're in aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual mode, absolutely exposure compensation is something to think about. And even just the tiniest little bit of variation, either plus or minus across your exposure compensation, can have a huge effect on pulling detail out of shadows or reducing the highlights in your image. So it's something that I think is very valuable to play with and experiment with. I think I've seen so many times now where just the tiniest variation either way can make such a huge impact on a scene. Now, in post-processing too, I find obviously you can lift shadows and you can drop highlights. There's so much more that you can still do in post-processing afterwards. But if you can get the majority of the work done correctly in the camera to begin with, it saves you a lot of time later. And obviously it's great to have those techniques anyway to ensure that that you're shooting the best that you possibly can.
There are, as I touched on before, you can use a spot exposure as well, where you pretty much set a specific area of your view of where you want it to be correctly exposed. So if you were shooting a person with the sun behind them, you could point a spot at their face and say, that's what I want to be correctly exposed, and that's what the camera will read. It won't read the entire scene as it normally would for just a general exposure setting, or even potentially a center-weighted exposure setting as well.
You remember that headache you gave me last episode?
Yes.
Yeah, I've got it again. There's too many things to think about there now. I think maybe next episode there's something we can touch on is what each of those settings actually do within the camera, because obviously there's so many different ways that your camera can calculate exposure as well. So I think you've just given us some topics for next episode.
Yeah, I probably wasn't. Yeah, didn't want to go too far into it because there is a lot, but it is something to mention when talking about exposure and exposure compensation, and what the camera is telling you is the correct exposure, and what you need to tell the camera you think the correct exposure should be.
That's correct. Yeah, because obviously the camera will generally calculate exposure based on the brightest part of a scene, unless you tell it otherwise. So exposure compensation is a great way to kind of dial in more settings into your camera to kind of correct that. And those other methods of exposure, spot evaluated, centimetering, those sort of things, that's something that we will definitely touch on next episode, because I think that's another part of your camera that many people probably don't ever look at and don't ever touch, but it can have such a great effect on the overall exposure and overall quality of an image. So,
and it can screw up your photos later if you forget to change it back.
Definitely cool. So hopefully some people will go and try using exposure compensation. As I say, I think it's one of the four important things within exposure. Typically, there's people class ISO, aperture, and shutter time or shutter speed as the three of the exposure triangle, but I believe exposure compensation is a hugely important part of that as well, especially if you can use it correctly.
Yep. Well, do you want to talk about JPEG Mini? I haven't heard of this until you actually brought it up, so why don't you give a brief introduction about what JPEG Mini is?
For sure. Look, I think at the moment with online stuff, particularly within websites, and let's not get too much into marketing this episode. Anybody who wants to listen to marketing stuff, go back to our last episode. But with online stuff, particularly within websites, it's really important to kind of have fast page load speeds and those sort of things. It's one of the key things that Google's looking at these days. So there's a few reasons that I would be looking potentially at JPEG Mini as a service, or also Tiny PNG. These are both similar and effectively do the same thing. There's a lot of information stored within the data of an image that really doesn't need to be there to present that image to a certain level of quality. So there's a lot of information that's kind of stored within, how do you say, the coding or the digital stamps of a file that you can really strip out and not necessarily need. Some of this stuff is your EXIF data, of course. Like EXIF data is actually part of this, how do you say it? It's
the skeleton of the image, maybe.
Absolutely, exactly. Like it's data that's stored there, which may not necessarily be required in an image. But there's also a lot of stuff, say, counting how many pixels wide an image is, and giving a color value to each of those pixels. Whereas you could potentially count how many pixels wide an image is and give a color value to a range of pixels, say from 1 to 50 is black, rather than saying pixel number 1, pixel number 2, pixel number 3. So in terms of the technical details of this, basically what JPEG Mini and Tiny PNG do is convert and strip data out of an image that isn't really required and saves space for that image, or effectively makes that image smaller. Now, I've got to say, in my experience, they don't always become 100% quality at the end process. So this is something to consider in the way this is being used. On the web, it probably doesn't matter so much, but a lot of people that I know that are using these systems are also using them for preview files for clients as well, using, rather than sending a 50 meg JPEG file, which is, so a Canon 5DS file at full resolution, they're sending far smaller files by using these systems to send through. For one, it's also protecting you as a photographer, not having to give away full quality files. Two, there's also potentially a lot of benefits in terms of saving size for the amount of data that gets transferred over an internet connection from your website. When you're looking at an image on a website, if you can possibly get them down to about 100 kilobytes in size, that's kind of your aim, I think, within the web development industry now per image to kind of get it to that size or smaller. And this technology within JPEG Mini and Tiny PNG effectively help you do that. And it's a great way to kind of help maximize and compress your images, but still maintain as much quality as you can within the image.
And speaking of websites, I'm just on the JPEG Mini website here, and they've got a nice little thing where you can look at the original and then the JPEG Mini, and you got a little slider to switch between the two, kind of like a before and after thing on the website. And I'm a little confused because I don't know which one should be better, because the original, you think, that should be a good quality image, and then the JPEG Mini should look exactly the same and say like, the JPEG Mini is better. But wouldn't the original be worse because it's done in a normal way, and then the JPEG Mini is done in a better way? So I'm a little confused as to what this is meant to represent.
Yeah, no, not at all. Like, this is obviously, you're looking at this page where it's comparing a 12 megabyte image versus a 2 megabyte image. So at full resolution, the 12 megabyte image should be far better quality than the 2 megabyte image. But these particular examples are great examples of the way this technology works, that the 2 megabyte image is just as good for the resolution you are looking at online as the original image. So it's actually a great example of exactly what this technology does. And I think there's both of these systems that I know of that are really good, and probably the industry standards of them, have plugins for Photoshop, Lightroom, and also for WordPress. So WordPress is probably the most widely used content management system for websites. So you can actually automate the process of storing and saving your images in a far smaller file size than the original size. So it's a great way to do this. Again, I'd be reluctant to be using these types of files if you were printing something at a billboard size. Obviously, you want the best quality resolution and you want to maximize your opportunity to have the best image. But for online purposes and for, say, previews for clients, there's nothing negative, I would say, about using this type of technology for doing so.
Well, since all my photos, I never take a photo unless it's going on a billboard. I don't think I would use just kidding. Yeah, it does look good. It'd be a good way to, as you said, reduce the file size and make websites run a bit faster, which I know just from personal experience, if I'm sitting there on a website and it's taking ages for just a single photo to load, or if it's running slow, it makes you want to do something else, because, I don't know, just got a short attention span these days.
Look, the industry standard these days is 4 seconds load time on a website. Now, you can test this through a particular thing called the Google Page Speed Test. There's plenty of website speed testers out there, but since a lot of performance factors are based on Google search rankings or SEO performance, using the Google page speed tests is probably the best way to kind of go about testing if that is your reason for doing so. So 4 seconds is kind of the industry standard now, or the industry aim for a load time. And there's been a lot of research put into this. So the faster you can make your website load, and obviously the more images you have on a website, the slower it's going to load, the better it's going to be for user experience, but also for one of the algorithmic factors in search to help make your page loads faster. Now, you got to think about this on a mobile phone as well. If you're at home and say you've got cable or ADSL2 or say NBN like we do here, it doesn't matter quite as much as say if you're on a mobile device, but I would be quite interested in knowing, or I would be very confident in saying a fair portion of traffic these days is delivered from mobile devices, particularly if you're getting, say, Facebook referrals or those sort of things. So making sure that your page can load as quickly as possible on all types of devices is really important, because wireless infrastructure, say your 3G and 4G, while it's advertised as being fast, there's so many factors in how that performs, and the faster you can make it load on the slowest type of internet connection that a user would use to access your website, the faster it's going to be. I'm using website load speed as an example of this technology, but there's so many other great purposes for it as well. I mean, just transferring images between people, quite often we're sending files to each other and they're 40, 50 megabytes plus on them. So if you can kind of transfer a smaller image and it still be of a good resolution or a good enough quality to use, then why not do it?
So, I mean, doesn't Photoshop and Lightroom make JPEGs and compress things as well?
Yeah, absolutely they do. But the actual technology behind these mini or the tiny, JPEG mini and tiny PNG, it's their own proprietary algorithms. You obviously can go in and kind of change the image quality of a JPEG. So you typically within Photoshop, if you're saving a JPEG, you've got a dial from 1 to 12. Within within Lightroom, you've got percentage, so 100% quality down to 0% quality. Those things are great, but they actually do visibly reduce the overall quality of your image. You can see the difference between an image that's saved at 60% and an image that's saved at 100% quality. That also affects your file size as well. Whereas the technology behind these other algorithms, the JPEG Mini and Tiny PNG, are really designed to reduce your file size with minimal loss of visual quality on an image. I'm not going to say it's 100% because I've seen examples where it's not, but I will say that they are far better, in my personal opinion and in my experience, than what Photoshop and Lightroom deliver at the same file size.
Cool. Do you want to have a chat about alternatives to Photoshop and Lightroom? I know we've sort of talked about JPEG Mini as an alternative for compressing files to a smaller size, but a lot of people out there either don't want to get into Photoshop or Lightroom because they think it's too complicated or sometimes too expensive, and they don't want to have a subscription to a product that they're not sure whether they're going to use too much. Are there any other options out there for people who just want to start editing their photos without getting really into it?
There's plenty of options out there. Obviously, Lightroom and Photoshop have been industry standard for a very long time. Adobe's a very big company and have kind of been able to cash into this by, again, tying people into an ecosystem of software. I mean, the ease of us to be able to switch and move files between Lightroom and Photoshop is one click. The other side of it is it's just become an industry standard simply because of the Camera Raw system that Adobe have really done quite well over time. But there are a lot of alternatives on the market now, and we're kind of talking packages like Affinity, Capture One, GIMP, and Darktable. There's plenty more on the market, and we'll put up some links to some of them. But again, in much the same way as camera innovation is hugely important, I believe the exact same thing with software innovation. And some of these packages like Capture One and Affinity are really driving innovation within the software market. And I think Adobe at the moment are having a bit of a hard time keeping up with how quickly some of these smaller companies, Phase One, who make Capture One, are not a small company, but how some of these lesser known software packages are helping to drive and continuously develop innovation within the software market.
And that's, I use Photoshop occasionally. I may touch on Lightroom. And so I haven't found any limitations or any problems with quality while using it. So I haven't felt like I needed to go out and try any of these other ones. There are lots of free ones out there as well. There are ones that do have a initial cost price, but they're not on a subscription basis. And I just had a look at the website for Affinity, and their little promotional video makes it look really fantastic and flash and new and powerful. But I guess it kind of comes back to Canon versus Nikon as well, and whether you're happy using a certain interface and finding one that works for you. And for instance, with Photoshop now, there'd have to be quite a large difference between Photoshop and another product for me to want to switch or even try something else.
Yeah, I think a lot of these packages aren't necessarily just designed to target Photoshop, because obviously Photoshop is a beast. I mean, there's not a lot that you can't do with Photoshop in terms of images, and obviously if you really wanted to, and if you had the knowledge, you can build an image pixel by pixel. I mean, that's the thing with Photoshop that kind of makes it so powerful is the control that you have over every element in an image. A lot of these I think are more targeted for the Lightroom market, whereas it's more of probably the less image manipulation and more so raw processing. I'm not going to say that they don't compete with Photoshop, because absolutely they do, and some of them have got great opportunities to create layers, layer masking, those sort of things. I know Capture One has been within the pro market, particularly within medium format users and higher resolution camera users. Capture One has been a fairly competitive software package for a very long time. I've used it. I think it's probably not as straightforward as using Lightroom in terms of its interface. And again, because of the complexity within the way that they've built their raw processing engine, that it's probably a little bit more complex and more complicated for many reasons. Affinity, I think, has kind of captured the attention of a lot of people because of its price points as well. With Photoshop and Lightroom now, if you're going down the CC path or the Creative Cloud path, it is a monthly subscription, whereas with Affinity, it's a US $50 once-off charge, and you get all updates up to the next full numbered version. So if you bought version 1 of Affinity, you get every minor update all the way through to version 2 of the software package, which is not out yet. For a while, Affinity's only been available on Mac. Now they are I believe the beta release is now out for Windows, that you can now trial and use. The reviews that I've read, I haven't tried it yet, and I probably would like to go and try it. I might even give it a go over the Christmas period to try and learn something new myself, set myself a bit of a challenge. As we say, there's plenty of alternatives out there that are there if you don't want to go down the Adobe path. So, and again, like, say if you were to use Linux as an operating system, and now I just met a guy a few weeks ago on the Overland track, a highly intelligent guy within the tech industry, teaches at a university in Melbourne, actually teaches computer systems and computer security. He uses Linux himself. And so he, I believe, uses Darktable as a software package, whereas Adobe is just not available on Linux. So he's had to seek alternatives simply because of his choice of operating system as well. These
ones as well, such as Capture One and probably Affinity as well, you can do initial raw processing, the same as you do Camera Raw in Adobe, and then go from there and do further adjustments or manipulation editing in Photoshop as well.
I was actually just discussing this last night with a group of photographers here in Hobart that I personally think Lightroom has started to slow down a lot over time. Now, I don't know whether this is because I'm handling bigger RAW files over the last 6 months with the 50 megapixel camera or not, but I've noticed Lightroom is really starting to, it's the whole interface is slowing down. The time it takes to load previews is far slower than it used to be. I don't know if that's the files that I'm handling or if that's Lightroom. So that's something as well that maybe, something to consider within that. If is Adobe really performing slower, or does one of these other software packages have a benefit over that? So
maybe it's your Apple.
Probably not, I'd say. Definitely not, actually.
No, you're not going to blame the Mac product.
No, I don't want to get into an argument with you right now. So. But look, there's plenty of opportunities and alternatives out there for using these other software systems. So I think it's something to consider. Right? And obviously, something about photography is people want to know as much as they possibly can. And if there is an alternative that works better for an individual, there's no reason why that individual shouldn't go down that path. And just as hardware in your hand could potentially suit you better, software packages can also do the same thing as well.
And I'd be interested to hear from our listeners as well, what editing software they use and whether they think that's Capture One, or if they use Affinity or any of the other ones, whether they find it to be adequate or even better than Photoshop if they've used that as well, or better than Lightroom, and to get in touch with us and let us know and let our other listeners know as well what the advantages are or disadvantages they've found, and I don't know, give their own little mini review of what the better options or what the other options are out there.
Yeah, definitely. That's something I would love to know as well. And I think this is something that I'm going to set as a little bit of a challenge for myself over Christmas, is to go and try some of these other software packages and see what the benefits of them are and kind of come up with my own impression and opinion of them. That's something that I'll be sitting there doing while everybody else is eating chocolates around me at my partner's family's house. I'll get to sit there attached to my screen, trialing Affinity and Capture One.
So we've got a couple of listener questions here. We've got one from at Dan the Detailer from Instagram, and he's asking us, or he says to us, I'm wondering why you guys shoot with the f2.8 lenses rather than the f4 versions, considering a lot of your shots are done at around f8.
Cool. Dan, thanks for this question. And also, I've got to point out, Dan, that I jumped the gun a little bit answering your question on Instagram after Kieran had already seen the message. So sorry for maybe ruining the surprise here of the question. But look, the f2.8 lenses for me personally are great astro lenses. So in the variety of lenses that I use regularly, the 16 to 35 f2.8 and the 24 to 70 f2.8 Canon lenses, for me it's all about the astro purposes. It just gives me the flexibility to kind of shoot the night sky a little bit better than the f4. Again, the results of them are very debatable because I know full well, Kieran, you use the f4 variety of these lenses and you shoot astro perfectly fine with them.
I'm quite happy with the f4. I had a consideration about how often I actually shoot astro, and I don't do it as often as I shoot other things, so going for the 2.8 wasn't really a good option for me. And the reviews of the f4 and what I'd seen of the quality as well were fantastic, so I'm very happy with the f4, and I still can shoot astro photography with it. And that's partly due to being able to use the Canon 5D and have a camera that is really good in low light. So I can go up to a higher ISO to get those low light situations, whereas of course the f2.8 gives you an extra stop of light that you can let in through the lens, so you don't need to bump up the ISO so much. But the quality is still amazing, and especially at f8 or f11, around the sweet spot of the lens.
Yeah, definitely. And look, we're talking obviously for landscape purposes here, and your question clearly says why do a lot of stuff is shot at f8, but in terms of other styles of photography, yes, there are other styles of photography, believe it or not, other than landscape photography. So for portraits and things, the f2.8 lenses are far better. I'm not going to say far better, but far more flexible in terms of the quality of image that you can produce. So I think a lot of portraits, you kind of like to have that really cool bokeh or the drop off of the background in the images. So f2.8 kind of helps that. Even if you can go f1.8 or f1.2, it's even better in terms of that particular type of image style. So f2.8 is great for that reason. And even for macro lenses and things, I think there are advantages depending on what sort of style of macro photography you're using in shooting at that shallower depth of field. So there's so many reasons for it. For me personally, budget-wise, it was an investment over a long term to have more flexibility in the f2.8 lenses, but the f4 versions are just as good for your average type of photography. Unless you're specifically shooting a very specific purpose of photography, the f4 Canon lenses that we talk about, and I'm sure just about any other brand, will perform just as well.
And I'm shooting with the f4 lens for a 16 to 35, which wouldn't really use for a portrait, so I don't really need to go down to that f4 value very much. So the 2.8 in the 24 to 70, was it? That would have a better use for a portrait setting at the more telephoto lengths there.
Absolutely. And again, as we discussed last episode, it kind of comes down to your budget and what reason you're using the lens for. The f2.8 variety of those lenses just give a bit more flexibility for different uses other than, your standard daytime landscape photography type stuff. But there are other ways that you can kind of counter and allow for an f4 lens rather than an f2.8 if you are shooting astrophotography as well.
Cool. Well, we've got another question as well. This one was sent to me from Santosh, and he says, "Hi, Kieran. How are you doing?" "I'm very well, thank you. I've been listening to all your RAWcast podcast, and I love it. In your next podcast, can you please address on how to get a photography website done and other important aspects?" And I'll probably open this up to you because you're probably more into the website development side of things. And
yeah, cool. So there's so many different ways to go down the website development path here. It depends on what your purpose is. Are you looking to sell photography? Are you looking to just display your photography? Are you looking to create a blog? Those sort of things. But some of the more common methods that are available are, say, smugmug.com, also squarespace.com or photoshelter.com. Now, every different type of platform like this has its own advantage. Obviously, they kind of help you get online quite quickly with pre-existing templates. They've got so many designs that are already there, which can be customized to a certain level. It kind of helps you to be online within an hour if you really want it to be. I personally don't use these, and just simply from my experience, I've kind of got the experience to go down different paths, but I use WordPress for pretty much all of my stuff inside my photography business, as well as client businesses and other projects that I operate online. So I use WordPress. I just like the flexibility of WordPress to be able to do more things with it and kind of being able to add plugins over time to perform different functions. I just also like the flexibility and customization of WordPress, and I love the back end of it where it's so flexible and easy to use. It's almost just like learning how to use Microsoft Word or something similar. With WordPress, you can buy pre-built templates, or you can make them if you really want to, if you know what you're doing. So if you know kind of how to code PHP and HTML and JavaScript, you can go down that path. But for $50 US, you could probably go and buy a template and customize it. And the reason you would get a pre-built template is because it's already performing 75% of what you would require, and the other 25% is your own personal choice of customization and your own personal usage purpose. Most of the guys that I know within the Australian landscape photography community, at least, use WordPress. Kieran, you use WordPress?
I use WordPress. I had a site built for me that runs through WordPress, so it's my own theme and heavily customized to what I wanted. I have, in the past, when I first started out, I had a photo shelter site, which was mainly just to have a presence online and have a place to show my photos. I've also made a website with Squarespace as well, and that was super easy to customize and everything. So I think it does come down to, again, what you can afford, and budget's a huge thing with photography, no matter what aspect you're thinking about. But there are some good options out there, and just have a shop around, see what different reviews are, and find what works for you.
One thing I know about those platforms, say SmugMug, Squarespace, PhotoShelter, those sort of things, is creating the website within that system kind of allows you to stay within their platform, whereas with WordPress, there's so many ways that you can kind of migrate your data from one new website to another. Obviously, there's still things that you would need to customize about that. But the data in the back end, which is actually a database, you can export that database and shift that between new WordPress installations. So the content in itself can kind of be moved between a new site and an old site and, kind of come with you over years. But you still would need to customize the way that content is displayed on a new theme, because one theme within WordPress doesn't mean to say it's going to exactly match the next theme. But the flexibility, I think, of just using a good content management system to begin with can be very beneficial over time. Again, though, these other types of things, SmugMug, Squarespace, Photo Shelter, you can be online quite quickly. If you've got the experience with WordPress, you can be online just as quickly as well, but it does take a little bit more to kind of get that knowledge in the first place.
Would you say that WordPress is like the Photoshop of websites and the other ones are sort of the Lightrooms and Affinities?
Yeah, look, I think that analogy is pretty good because obviously the flexibility of what you can do with WordPress is pretty much endless. You can, if you know what you're doing with WordPress, there's not a lot you can't do with websites. From my experience, I do find you probably need to have a bit of do a bit of research into website security. One thing with WordPress is there's kind of stats out there that whether they're true or not, I don't know, but saying that WordPress now powers up to 40% of all websites within a certain ranking of types of websites. And this makes it a target for people as well. So don't kind of let this, prevent you from going down this path because it's quite easy to secure a WordPress website. But the reason that it's become so popular is because it is so flexible. But because it is popular, there are things that you need to consider with security as well, because any script-based development code can be a target for people who kind of want to go and do malicious things or use the resources on your server. I would still go WordPress. Even knowing that myself, the flexibility of it is just awesome.
This episode's really been a comparison kind of episode, hasn't it? We've been comparing things left, right, and center, whether it's Canon, Nikon, or f2.8, f4, and websites. And can we compare digital SLRs to smartphones?
I think you can. There's a kind of a saying that floats around that the best camera is the camera that you have on you at that time. I think at the moment there's just been so much innovation again within the mobile technology or mobile camera technology. It's not there yet for full pro photographers in terms of, or even if I was to go out and shoot 5-minute long exposures of a beautiful sunset and streaky clouds, it's probably not there yet for that type of technology. But mobile phone technology in terms of the cameras and the software packages or the apps that are on them have jumped and come forward so quickly. The current generation iPhone 7 Pluses have got a 12 megapixel camera, which it doesn't seem like much, but the quality of the images is quite awesome. The new Google Pixels, which kind of rumors around that they probably have one of the better cameras, comparable to any other mobile phone. But we've got an example of a cover, which are a very prominent magazine in Sports Illustrated have recently just done a very specific shoot of The Rock for their cover or for the new cover of their magazine. And it's all been done with a mobile phone. Now, it's a Motorola Moto Z. I don't really ever see these cameras in the hands of people in Australia. I'm sure they are here, but mate, if they think it's good enough, I'm sure they are good enough to do so.
And just if you have a look at the cover as well, just on, we'll put up a link to so you can see what the picture is. It looks fine. It looks like a cover photo, unless or even if you are told that it was shot with a smartphone, you probably wouldn't look at it and think, that's like, what have they done? They've dropped the quality of their photos for this. You'd see it and think, it's just a normal cover photo. So yeah, it looks fine.
I think any camera in the hands of the right person could be used in a fantastic way. I mean, if you know how to use a camera and you know the major settings of exposure, you know what lighting does for an image, and you know the post-processing techniques, I don't think it really matters what camera an experienced and good photographer is using. They can get the results out of it anyway. And I think this is a great example of exactly that. And most of us walk around with a mobile phone in our pocket all day. So our go-to cameras for quick shots is more often than not our mobile phones. I'm seeing it now myself, even with the iPhone 7 Plus. I think amazing camera performance. I'm really, really liking seeing how quickly technology is evolving within mobile phone cameras. And in the hands of the right person, it probably doesn't really make much of a difference what camera they've got. They're going to get great photos anyway.
I mean, you've probably heard it as well, and comments made saying, I could take photos like that, or the reason you can take good photos is because you've got a big, expensive camera, and I bet you couldn't take great photos with just a crappy little camera that I've got. And as you're saying, like if you've got the knowledge of how cameras work, then I guess there are some other limitations, but you can still get really good photos if you know the limitations and what you're capable of taking a photo of with what you've got.
We were just sitting together with a group of four of us last night having drinks, and one of the guys who was there is one of Tasmania's most prominent wilderness photographers. Now, he pulled out his mobile phone and started flicking through some images that he just took on a recent trip that he was on. If he didn't tell us that they were taken on a mobile, we would never have known. We were looking at him just going, wow, that's incredible. That's a beautiful image. And then he's like, yeah, I took that on my mobile. I'm like, okay, well, that makes it even better because, you know, we obviously know how good he is with his normal camera, and we know how good he is with compositions, and we know he understands light and all those sort of things. And to hear him say this was taken on a mobile phone, we were just like, wow, like that's really cool. And obviously we knew we were going to lead into this discussion for this episode, and a perfect example of it there for me was exactly that. A great photographer who just had the camera that he had on him and was able to take a great photo. It doesn't matter what camera it is. If it was a mobile phone in this particular instance, the images, we wouldn't have known. If he didn't say it, we would never have known.
Cool. Well, I think we've probably run a bit longer for this episode 10. It's a nice round number to... I guess we're not finishing up the year. We'll still continue on. We'll keep going. Episodes 11 through to 100 are still to follow.
Definitely look at it. So we're going to take a couple of weeks break here. So we'll probably release the next episode sometime around the 28th of December or so.
Somewhere around there.
Look, so you're off on a few week jaunt starting this Sunday?
Yes.
Saturday.
Yes. Sunday. I think my wife and I have got a bit of time off, so we're going to just go for a leisurely drive over to WA. Why not?
Just because you can?
Just because we can.
Where are you stopping off on the way? What are you planning on shooting?
I haven't got a really solid plan, but there's a few little spots that we hope to see, but we'll probably start in Melbourne, go through Mount Gambier, Adelaide, all the way across the Nullarbor. Maybe before that, of course, maybe stop at Kangaroo Island, head over to Esperance and Albany, and
nice. Cool.
Come back.
Sounds like a nice little break. So you're no doubt going to get Maria to carry a lot of your gear for you most of the time.
Yeah, I might just get her to drive, and then I'll just say, stop, and pull over and jump out, take photos, jump back in the car. Drive.
Cool. So we're going to record the next episode while you're on the road there. So it'll be kind of interesting. I want to hear some stories about what you're shooting and what you're doing and what you're seeing along the way, and maybe, share a little bit of a inside knowledge into some of the little challenges you're having while you're on the road of getting some quality images and recording this episode. I think the biggest challenge I'm going to have is finding decent Wi-Fi while driving around, but I'm sure I'll stay somewhere that's got good Wi-Fi to record. Cool. I'm off to Sydney tomorrow. So yeah, I'm off. It'll be tomorrow by the time I'm up there. So I'm going to go and catch up with a few guys up there and go to check out some new stuff from Nisi. So might have some news about that as well in the next episode. So. Last episode before Christmas. Hope everybody has an awesome break over the Christmas time and has some great time with their family. If you are looking for some presents for that special photographer in your life or for yourself to wrap up and put under the Christmas tree, don't forget we still have our Nisi offer on. So all listeners to our podcast get 5% off all Nisi products at nisifilters.com.au. I can't think of a better Christmas present than a nice set of filters to whack on my camera. Hint, hint, Susan.
And also, if you're wanting something good for yourself, chuck your photos up on Instagram and hashtag Project RAWcast and mention us clearly in your caption, and you could win a great tutorial from F-Stoppers.
Definitely. We'll be drawing that this Sunday afternoon, so December the 18th at 6 p.m. So stay tuned on Instagram, but keep all of those awesome images rolling in. And until next episode, I hope everybody has an awesome break over the holidays and take some awesome photos. So.
All right. Until then, catch you later.
Cool. See you, mate. Bye.